My cousin stole my identity and ruined my credit. I spent 5 years planning the perfect legal revenge. 5 years ago, I discovered something that turned my world completely upside down. I was 24, fresh out of college, and trying to apply for my first apartment when the rental office called me back with confusion in their voice. They told me my credit score was so low that they couldn't even consider my application. I was stunned because I had been incredibly careful with money my entire life, never owned a single credit card, and had always paid my student loans on time. That phone call sent me into a panic spiral that lasted weeks. I immediately pulled my credit report, and what I saw made my stomach drop to the floor. There were 7 different credit cards in my name, a car loan for a vehicle I had never seen, and even a mortgage application that had been denied but still showed up as an inquiry. The total debt was over $60,000, and every single account was either maxed out or severely delinquent. I spent the next month making phone calls, filing dispute after dispute, and trying to figure out how this could have happened. The process was exhausting and humiliating. Every customer service representative I spoke to treated me like I was lying, like I was just another deadbeat trying to get out of paying my bills. I had to explain over and over again that I had never applied for these accounts, never received any cards or statements, and had no idea how someone could have done this to me. The breakthrough came when I was reviewing one of the credit card applications that had been approved. The address listed was my grandmother's house, where I had lived briefly during high school after my parents divorced. But what caught my attention was the signature on the application. It looked remarkably similar to mine, but there were small differences that made my blood run cold. The way the loops were formed, the slant of the letters, it was almost perfect, but not quite. I knew exactly who had access to my personal information during those years at my grandmother's house. My cousin had been living there too, and she was the only person who could have watched me sign documents, homework assignments, and birthday cards enough times to forge my signature with that level of accuracy. She was 3 years older than me, and I had always looked up to her as the cool, confident older sister I never had. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some random identity theft by a stranger. This was betrayal by someone I had trusted completely. Someone who had sat at family dinners with me, who had painted my nails during sleepovers, who had helped me practice driving in my grandmother's old sedan. She had systematically destroyed my financial future while I was completely oblivious to what was happening. I confronted my grandmother first, hoping she might have some insight into what had happened. She was devastated when I explained the situation, but she confirmed what I already suspected. My cousin had been receiving mail at the house for years, even after she moved out. She had always been secretive about her finances and had a habit of taking packages before anyone else could see them. My grandmother had assumed she was just ordering things online and having them delivered to a more secure location. The next step was gathering evidence, and this is where things got really complicated. I couldn't just march over to my cousin's apartment and demand answers. I needed proof that would hold up if I decided to pursue legal action. I spent weeks documenting everything, taking photos of signatures, gathering all the fraudulent accounts, and creating a timeline of when each account was opened. I also started paying attention to my cousin's lifestyle in a way I never had before. She was living in an expensive apartment downtown, driving a car that should have been way outside her budget, and constantly posting photos from expensive restaurants and shopping trips. She had always been vague about her work situation, claiming she did various freelance projects, but now I realized she had been living off my stolen identity for years. The emotional toll of this discovery was overwhelming. I felt angry, betrayed, and completely violated all at once. But underneath all of that was a deep sadness that someone I loved could have done this to me. I kept thinking about all the times we had spent together, wondering if she had been planning this theft even while we were laughing and making memories. I knew I had to report this to the police, but I was terrified of what it would do to our family. My grandmother was already in her 80s and had heart problems. My aunt, who was my cousin's mother, had always been fragile and struggled with depression. The thought of tearing apart our small family was almost as painful as the financial devastation I was facing. But I also knew I couldn't let this go. My credit was ruined, I couldn't get an apartment, and I was getting collection calls every single day. Some of the debt collectors were aggressive and threatening, and I was starting to have panic attacks every time my phone rang. I was living in a tiny studio apartment that I could barely afford, eating ramen noodles for every meal, and watching my friends move forward with their lives while I was stuck in this nightmare. After 2 months of internal struggle, I finally filed a police report. The officer who took my statement was surprisingly understanding and explained that family-related identity theft was more common than I realized. He told me that the investigation would take time, but that I had a strong case based on the evidence I had gathered. The waiting period was agonizing. I couldn't tell anyone in my family what was happening because I was afraid word would get back to my cousin before the police could build their case. I was carrying this enormous secret while still having to see her at family gatherings, still having to smile and make small talk while knowing what she had done to me. During this time, I started researching everything I could about identity theft, credit repair, and legal remedies. I learned about the long-term consequences of what had happened to me, how it would affect my ability to buy a house, get certain jobs, or even rent a decent apartment. The more I learned, the angrier I became, but I also started to see a path forward. Update 1. The investigation begins. 3 months after filing the police report, I got a call that changed everything. The detective assigned to my case had been busy, and what he told me was both shocking and strangely satisfying. My cousin hadn't just stolen my identity. She had been running a sophisticated fraud operation that involved multiple family members and friends. The detective explained that when they started investigating the addresses and phone numbers associated with the fraudulent accounts, they discovered a pattern. My cousin had been using variations of names and information from at least 6 different people in our extended family and social circle. She had apparently been doing this for over 7 years, long before she even targeted me. What made this revelation particularly devastating was learning that I wasn't her first victim within our own family. She had previously stolen the identity of our older cousin, who lived across the country. He had dealt with similar credit issues years earlier but had never been able to figure out what happened. When the detective contacted him as part of the investigation, he was both relieved to finally have answers and furious that it had taken so long to uncover the truth. The detective also discovered that my cousin had been using a fake address, a mail forwarding service, to receive the credit cards and statements. This explained why I had never seen any of the physical cards or bills. She had set up an elaborate system to intercept everything before it could reach me or raise suspicion with other family members. But the most shocking part of the investigation was learning about the scope of her spending. The detective showed me records of where the stolen money had been spent, and it painted a picture of someone living a completely fabricated lifestyle. She had been using my credit to pay for everything from luxury vacations to designer clothes to expensive medical procedures. She had even used my information to lease her apartment and finance her car. I felt sick looking at the evidence. Every family gathering where she had shown up with expensive gifts, every photo she posted from exotic locations, every time she had picked up the check at dinner, it was all paid for with money stolen from me and others. She had been living a lie for years, and we had all been unknowingly celebrating her success. The detective told me that they were preparing to make an arrest, but that I should be prepared for the impact this would have on my family. He warned me that family fraud cases were particularly difficult because they often tore apart relationships that could never be repaired. He was right to warn me, but I was beyond the point of caring about protecting someone who had shown no concern for protecting me. When the arrest happened, it was everything I had expected and worse. My cousin was taken into custody at her apartment, and the news spread through our family like wildfire. My aunt called me sobbing, begging me to drop the charges and work something out privately. My grandmother was hospitalized with chest pains from the stress. Other family members were divided between supporting me and trying to protect my cousin. The family gatherings that followed were tense and painful. Some relatives accused me of being vindictive and destroying the family over money. Others were supportive but kept suggesting that I should consider forgiveness and moving on. Nobody seemed to understand that this wasn't just about money. It was about years of betrayal, about my stolen future, about the fact that someone I trusted had been systematically destroying my life while looking me in the eye and pretending to care about me. The legal process moved slowly, but during this time I started to see some positive changes in my situation. With the police report and evidence of fraud, I was able to get most of the accounts removed from my credit report. It wasn't instant, Each account had to be disputed separately, and some creditors were more cooperative than others. But gradually, my credit score started to improve. However, the emotional healing was much more complicated. I found myself second-guessing every relationship in my life, wondering who else might be taking advantage of me without my knowledge. I became paranoid about sharing personal information and started checking my credit report obsessively. The trust one had always felt toward family members was shattered, and I didn't know how to rebuild it. During this period, I also started to piece together other incidents from the past that now made sense. Times when my cousin had asked to borrow my driver's license to get into bars when she forgot hers. Occasions when she had offered to help me with paperwork or applications. Moments when she had been oddly interested in my personal information or financial situation. Looking back, I could see the pattern of someone who had been planning this theft for a long time. Update 2. The legal proceedings and family fallout. The court proceedings began almost a year after the initial arrest, and by this time the case had grown far beyond what anyone had expected. The prosecutor explained that my cousin was facing multiple felony charges related to identity theft, credit fraud, and mail fraud. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her own spending records had provided a clear trail of criminal activity. But what happened next was something I never could have predicted. 2 days before her trial was scheduled to begin, my cousin's attorney contacted the prosecutor with a plea deal proposal. She was willing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. But there was a catch that blindsided everyone involved. My cousin claimed that she had been coerced into committing these crimes by an abusive boyfriend who had threatened her if she didn't comply with his demands. She said he had forced her to steal identities and open credit accounts, and that she had been living in fear for years. Her attorney presented evidence of this alleged abuse, including photos of bruises and threatening text messages. This revelation completely changed the dynamic of the case and my own feelings about the situation. I had been so focused on my anger and desire for justice that I hadn't considered the possibility that my cousin might also be a victim. The prosecutor explained that if her claims were true, it could significantly impact her sentencing and might even lead to charges against the boyfriend. I was torn between skepticism and concern. Part of me wondered if this was just another manipulation, another lie designed to get her out of trouble. But another part of me remembered signs I might have missed, times when she had seemed anxious or fearful, phone calls she had taken privately, the way she had sometimes flinched when certain topics came up in conversation. The investigation into her abuse claims took months, during which time I was stuck in an emotional limbo. I couldn't fully hate her if she had been forced into these actions, but I also couldn't forget the years of damage she had caused to my life. The prosecutor kept me updated on their findings, and gradually a picture emerged that was more complicated than anyone had expected. It turned out that my cousin's claims were partially true. She had been in an abusive relationship with someone who had pressured her into financial crimes. However, the timeline didn't match up perfectly with all of the fraudulent activity. Some of the accounts had been opened before she met this boyfriend, and some had continued after they broke up. The prosecutor concluded that while she may have been coerced into some of the crimes, she had also been acting independently for a significant portion of the fraud. During this time, my family was completely fractured. My aunt had become convinced that her daughter was a victim and blamed me for not supporting her during this difficult time. My grandmother was caught in the middle and became increasingly frail from the stress of the situation. Other relatives chose sides, and family gatherings became impossible. The most difficult part was dealing with my own conflicted emotions. I wanted to feel compassion for my cousin if she had truly been abused, but I also felt manipulated by this new information. I wondered if I was being played again, if this was just another elaborate lie designed to make me feel guilty for pursuing justice. I decided to attend one of the court hearings where my cousin was expected to testify about the abuse. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as she described years of psychological and physical abuse. She cried as she talked about being threatened and controlled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked genuinely vulnerable and broken. But when she was cross-examined by the prosecutor, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. Dates didn't line up, and some of her claims couldn't be verified. The prosecutor pressed her about the fraudulent accounts that had been opened before she met the alleged abuser. and she became defensive and evasive. Watching this unfold, I realized that she was probably telling some version of the truth, but not the whole truth. The judge ultimately sentenced her to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and full restitution to all victims. The sentence was less than what she could have received if convicted at trial, but more than what she would have gotten if her abuse claims had been fully substantiated. In many ways, it felt like a fair compromise, though I wasn't sure how I felt about the concept of fairness anymore. Update 3. The unexpected twist. Just when I thought the legal proceedings were over and I could start to move on with my life, I received a phone call that changed everything once again. It was from a private investigator who had been working on a related case, and what he told me left me completely speechless. My cousin's ex-boyfriend, the one she claimed had coerced her into committing fraud, had been arrested on unrelated charges. During his arrest, police had searched his apartment and found evidence of a much larger identity theft operation. Among the items seized were documents with my name and information, but also something that made my blood run cold: detailed notes about my daily routine, my work schedule, and even photos of me that had been taken without my knowledge. The investigator explained that this man had been running an identity theft ring that specifically targeted young women from middle-class families. He would identify potential victims, gather information about them, and then manipulate vulnerable women into carrying out the actual fraud. My cousin had been one of several women he had used for this purpose, but the evidence suggested that he had been planning to target me directly if the scheme with my cousin hadn't been discovered. This revelation completely reframed everything I thought I knew about the situation. My cousin hadn't just stolen my identity on a whim or out of desperation. She had been part of a calculated criminal operation that had been targeting me specifically. The man behind it had been studying my life, learning my habits, and preparing to destroy my future in ways I couldn't have imagined. The investigator showed me photos of the evidence that had been seized from the apartment. There were files on dozens of young women, complete with credit reports, family information, and personal details. My file was one of the thickest, suggesting that I had been marked as a particularly valuable target. The level of detail was terrifying. They knew where I worked, where I shopped, what time I usually came home, and even what my car looked like. But the most disturbing discovery was a recording device that had been hidden in my grandmother's house. The investigator explained that this man had likely used my cousin to plant surveillance equipment in places where I spent time. He had been listening to my conversations, learning about my plans and my personal information, and using that knowledge to make the identity theft more effective. I felt violated in a way I hadn't experienced even when I first discovered the fraud. The idea that someone had been watching me and listening to my private conversations for months or possibly years was absolutely terrifying. Every memory I had of feeling safe and secure in my grandmother's house was now tainted by the knowledge that someone had been monitoring my every word. The investigator also revealed that my cousin had been receiving payments for her participation in the scheme. She hadn't just been coerced or manipulated. She had been paid a percentage of the money that was stolen using my identity. This completely contradicted her claims about being an unwilling victim and made me realize that I had been manipulated once again. Armed with this new information, the prosecutor reopened my cousin's case. The evidence of her willing participation in a larger criminal enterprise meant that her sentence could be significantly increased. She was brought back to court, and this time there were no tears or claims of victimization. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she finally admitted to her full involvement in the scheme. The additional charges resulted in a much longer sentence, 5 years in prison, plus extended probation and restitution not just to me, but to all of the victims who had been identified through the investigation. The man who had been running the operation received an even longer sentence, and several other participants were also arrested and charged. Final update: justice and moving forward. 3 years have passed since my cousin was sentenced, and the journey to rebuild my life has been both harder and more rewarding than I ever expected. The legal battle is finally over, but the emotional healing has been a much longer process. My credit score has been fully restored, and I've been able to move forward with major life decisions that had been put on hold during the years of legal proceedings. I bought my first house last year, got engaged to someone who has been incredibly supportive throughout this entire ordeal, and even started my own small business. In many ways, my life is better now than it was before the identity theft happened. But the impact on my family has been permanent and profound. My grandmother passed away 18 months ago, and I still believe the stress from this situation contributed to her declining health. My aunt and I haven't spoken since the final court hearing, and several other family relationships have been irreparably damaged. The cousin who was also victimized by this scheme has become one of my closest allies, and we've worked together to help other identity theft victims navigate the legal system. I've also become involved in advocacy work around identity theft prevention and family fraud awareness. Many people don't realize that family members are responsible for a significant percentage of identity theft cases, and that these crimes often go unreported because victims are afraid to pursue legal action against relatives. I speak at workshops and support groups, sharing my story and helping others understand that they're not alone in dealing with this type of betrayal. The most surprising outcome of this entire experience has been learning about my own strength and resilience. 5 years ago, I was a naive young woman who trusted everyone and never questioned people's motives. The person I am today is more cautious, but also more confident and self-assured. I've learned to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, and to prioritize my own well-being even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. My cousin was released from prison 6 months ago, and I've heard through family members that she's struggling to rebuild her life. Part of me feels compassion for her situation, but a larger part of me believes that she needs to face the consequences of her choices. She's made no attempt to contact me directly, which is probably for the best. The man who orchestrated the identity theft ring is still in prison and will be for many years to come. The investigation into his activities led to the discovery of hundreds of victims across multiple states, and the case became a landmark prosecution in the fight against organized identity theft. Knowing that my decision to pursue legal action helped protect other potential victims has been one of the most meaningful aspects of this entire experience. I've learned that healing from this type of betrayal isn't linear or predictable. Some days I feel completely over it, strong and proud of how I handled everything. Other days I still feel angry about the years that were stolen from me, the stress that was put on my family, and the innocence that was lost. But overall, I'm grateful for the lessons I've learned and the person I've become. The most important thing I want other people to understand is that identity theft by family members is not something you have to endure or cover up to protect family relationships. These crimes have real consequences that can affect your entire future, and the people who commit them need to be held accountable regardless of their relationship to you. It's not about being vindictive or unforgiving. It's about protecting yourself and ensuring that justice is served. Looking back on the 5 years since I first discovered the fraud, I can honestly say that pursuing legal action was the right choice, even though it was incredibly difficult and painful. The alternative would have been to let my cousin continue destroying lives while I struggled with damaged credit and financial instability. By taking a stand, I not only protected myself but also helped uncover a larger criminal operation that was hurting many other innocent people. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is to document everything, report the crime to law enforcement, and don't let family pressure convince you to handle it privately. These crimes rarely involve just one victim, and the person who stole your identity will likely continue to harm others if they're not stopped. You deserve justice, you deserve to have your financial future protected, and you deserve to be surrounded by people who respect and care about you. The road to recovery has been long and sometimes lonely, but I'm proud of the choices I made and the strength I discovered within myself. My cousin may have stolen my identity for a few years, but she couldn't steal my determination to rebuild and create a better life for myself. In the end, that's been my greatest victory.